Sometimes a plane goes down and the first line you hear on the news is, "There was one survivor." Behind that sentence is a broken airplane, a long search through the wreckage, and one person who has to live with a story no one else remembers. In this video, we follow 9 of those cases, from jungle crash sites to open ocean and city streets. If you'd like to stay with us for more investigations like this, you can subscribe and be here for the next one. She fell 2 miles from the sky, still strapped to her seat. On Christmas Eve 1971, JAT Flight 508 left Lima a little after noon, heading toward the Peruvian rainforest with a full load of holiday travelers. The airplane was a Lockheed Electra turboprop, belonging to a small carrier with a poor safety record, one that Julianne Kopske's father had begged her mother to avoid. For 17-year-old Julianne, who had just graduated from high school and was flying home with her mother to a remote research station, it was supposed to be a short hop and a familiar route. The flight was delayed, people were tired, and when the crew saw a line of storms ahead, they pressed on instead of turning back. There was pressure to get everyone home for Christmas. That pressure helped set the stage for what followed. As the Electra climbed to cruise altitude, the cabin began to shudder in turbulence. Outside, lightning flickered around the wings. At about 21,000 feet, a bolt appears to have struck one of the wings. Passengers saw a bright flash and fire racing along the right side. The airplane lurched. Then the entire cabin tore apart. The structural loads from the turbulence pushed the Electra beyond what it could withstand. The wings and tail separated. The fuselage began to disintegrate in midair over dense jungle. Julianne remembers one moment more clearly than most. The cabin around her vanished, and she found herself suddenly in open air, still strapped into a 3-seat row that had broken free from the floor. She was no longer inside a plane. She was falling under a strip of sky with forests spinning below. The row of seats may have acted like a crude parachute, slowing and stabilizing the fall. She passed through layers of storm cloud and heavy rain, then into the thick green canopy of the Amazon. Branches ripped at her, absorbing some of the impact before she hit the forest floor. At some point, she lost consciousness. When she came to, the jungle was quiet, except for insects and distant bird calls. She could not see the wreckage. There was no sign of other survivors. Her collarbone was broken. One eye was swollen shut. She had a deep cut on her arm and a serious concussion. She was 17 years old and alone in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. What kept her alive over the next 11 days was not a rescue operation closing in from the outside, but the survival knowledge her parents had given her since childhood. Julianne had grown up at a research station in the rainforest. She knew that following moving water often leads to people. She found a small creek and began to walk downstream, staying in the water as much as she could to avoid snakes and insects. Her injuries made every step hard. Mosquitoes swarmed her cuts. A botfly laid eggs in the wound on her arm. The larvae burrowed into her flesh. She was wearing only a light dress and one sandal. At night, she tried to sleep on the muddy banks. During the day, she heard aircraft overhead, but the canopy was too thick for anyone to see her. Sometimes pieces of the crash appeared along the creek. She found fragments of the fuselage and bodies of other passengers, including people who had clearly survived the initial breakup, but died waiting for help that never came. As many as 14 people are believed to have lived through the fall, only to perish in the jungle, out of reach of search teams that did not know where to look. For Julianne, it was a harsh reminder that being the one who lives is not the same as being the one who was meant to live. On the 9th day, she came across a small wooden hut near the river. Inside were supplies left by local lumbermen. The next day, 3 men returned to the camp and found her. At first they thought she might be a forest spirit. She was so thin and covered in insect bites. When they realized she was a survivor from the crash, they cleaned her wounds, put her in a canoe, and took her downriver for hours until they reached a village where a rescue flight could land. Only then did the outside world learn that there had been a survivor at all. Julianne helped search teams locate the crash site and identify bodies, including her mother's. The airline lost its operating license days later and never flew again. Julianne went on to study biology like her parents, eventually becoming a scientist specializing in bats. She has spent much of her life answering the same question: how did you survive? The more difficult question, which she explores in her own book, is what it means to live the rest of your life as the only person who walked away from a sky full of empty seats above an endless jungle. On January 26, 1972, JAT Flight 367 left Copenhagen on a routine winter afternoon, heading for Zagreb and Belgrade. The McDonnell Douglas DC-9 carried 28 people and a small Yugoslav crew. Among them was 22-year-old flight attendant Vesna Vulović, still new to the job and proud of her turquoise uniform. She was only on this particular flight because of a scheduling mix-up with another stewardess who shared her first name. About 40 minutes after takeoff, as the DC-9 cruised over Czechoslovakia at around 33,000 feet, that ordinary day ended in a single violent moment. An explosion ripped through the forward baggage compartment. The pressurized cabin tore open, the fuselage broke apart in mid-air, and most of those on board were thrown straight out into clear, sub-freezing sky. On the ground near the village of Srpska Kamenic, people heard a distant crack, looked up, and saw burning fragments of an airplane falling out of low winter clouds. Somewhere in that breakup, Vesna did not fall free. The rear galley section stayed together a little longer than the rest, and she ended up trapped inside it, pinned by a catering cart. Instead of being blown clear, she rode that torn-off section down. It plunged into a wooded hillside, smashing through snow and trees before coming to rest in the forest. Local man Bruno Honka, a former wartime medic, followed the sound of cries and found the wreckage. Among the twisted metal and bodies, he saw a young flight attendant, shoes torn off, uniform soaked in blood, barely conscious but still breathing. Her injuries were severe. Hospital records describe a fractured skull, crushed vertebrae, a broken pelvis, broken ribs, and both legs broken, along with massive internal bleeding. She spent 27 days in a coma and woke up temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Everything after boarding the aircraft in Copenhagen was gone. The explosion, the fall, the impact, even the first weeks in intensive care had vanished from her memory. When she finally became fully aware in a Prague hospital, she had to be told that there had been a crash and that she was the only person on Flight 367 who had survived. While she lay in intensive care, investigators tried to understand why the DC-9 had come apart. The flight recorders showed no sign of mechanical failure or pilot error. The pattern of damage pointed instead to an explosive device in checked luggage in the forward hold. At the time, Yugoslav authorities were dealing with a series of attacks by émigré Croatian nationalist groups, and a caller claiming to represent such a group took responsibility. No one was ever convicted, but the official report concluded that a briefcase bomb had destroyed Flight 367 at cruise altitude. For Vesna, those conclusions were background to a more immediate battle, learning to live in her body again. Months in traction were followed by slow rehabilitation as doctors tried to rebuild strength. At first, she could not feel her legs. Gradually, sensation returned, then some control. Less than a year after the crash, she managed to stand with support, then take a few steps, and eventually walk short distances on her own. She would always limp and live with chronic pain, but to the medical team, her survival and recovery were almost beyond explanation. Guinness World Records eventually recognized her as the person who had survived the highest fall without a parachute, a descent from roughly 10,000 meters inside a fragment of airliner fuselage, and that whenever she thought seriously about the accident, she ended up in tears. She died in 2016 at age 66, living on a modest pension in a small Belgrade apartment, far from the TV studios where she had once told her story. On paper, JAT Flight 367 is just one line in a long list of 1970s bombings. A DC-9 destroyed over Czechoslovakia, 27 people killed, 1 survivor. Behind that line is a young woman who boarded a routine afternoon flight, rode a shattered airplane down from the edge of the stratosphere, and then had to build an ordinary, complicated life on the far side of something almost no one else on Earth has ever lived through. She was 4 years old, strapped into her seat, the only survivor. On August 16, 1987, Northwest Flight 255 pushed back from the gate in Detroit on a routine Sunday night departure. The airplane was a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 with 155 people on board, bound for Phoenix. It was hot, hazy, and busy. Crews were trying to make up time. In the cabin, parents settled kids, stowed bags, and buckled seatbelts. Among them was a 4-year-old girl from Arizona named Cecelia Cichan, traveling with her mother, father, and 6-year-old brother after visiting family in Pennsylvania. From the outside, the airplane looked perfectly normal as it taxied toward the runway. On the inside, one small but crucial thing had already gone wrong. The takeoff configuration checklist was not completed properly. The trailing edge flaps and leading edge slats, which should have been extended to give the wing extra lift at low speed, were still fully retracted. The crew missed it, and a tripped circuit breaker meant the warning system that should have screamed at them stayed silent. When they pushed the throttles forward, there was no horn, no electronic voice saying "wrong configuration," just the usual rise in engine noise and the sense of a heavy airplane beginning to to roll. The MD-82 accelerated down the runway, but with a clean wing, it needed more speed than usual to fly. Near the far end, the captain pulled back on the controls to rotate. The nose came up, the main wheels lifted. For a brief moment, the jet was airborne. It never really climbed. The wing, starved of lift, stalled almost immediately. The airplane rolled left, the wing dropped, and the descent began. Outside the airport fence, drivers on nearby Middle Belt Road saw something impossible. An airliner low over the highway, banking and dropping where no airplane should be. Seconds later, the left wing clipped a light pole at a rental car lot. The jet plowed into vehicles, then hit an overpass, breaking apart and scattering debris and fire across the road and into a field. 2 people in cars on the ground were killed. For everyone on the airplane, it appeared there could be no chance at all. First responders arriving at the scene found burning wreckage, torn luggage, and twisted metal. In those first minutes, the working assumption was simple. There were no survivors. Then a firefighter noticed something small and out of place on the ground. An airplane seat, upside down, with a child still strapped into it. The seat had been thrown clear of the main impact and the fires that followed. The little girl was badly burned, her skull, collarbone, and leg fractured, but she was breathing. At first, rescuers thought she might have been in one of the cars on the road. It did not seem possible that anyone from the jet had survived. Only later, when passenger lists were checked against hospital records, did it become clear that she had been on flight 255, and that she was the only person on the airplane who had lived. Her name was Cecelia. She spent weeks in a Detroit hospital, much of that time in a burn unit. Surgeons grafted skin, stabilized fractures, and fought infections. Reporters outside called her the miracle child. When she was finally discharged, after about 54 days, she left Michigan quietly and went to live with an aunt and uncle in Alabama. She had lost her mother, father, and brother in the crash. Investigators concluded that there had been no wind shear, no mechanical failure, no hidden defect. The airplane crashed because it tried to take off with flaps and slats retracted, something that should have been caught by the checklist and backed up by the warning system. A single tripped circuit breaker had silently disabled the horn. The crash became a textbook case on how routine and familiarity can erode basic safety barriers. For Cecelia, now using her married name, Cecelia Crocker, the technical explanations would always sit alongside something more personal. She grew up away from Detroit, went to school, built a career, and for many years refused all interviews. She has said she has no memory of the crash itself, only small fragments from before the flight. When she finally spoke publicly in the documentary Sole Survivor, she talked not about miracles, but about survivors' guilt and the effort of living with a story everyone else wants to discuss and she cannot fully remember. An airplane fell onto a highway. 154 passengers and crew died. 2 people on the ground died, and a single 4-year-old in an airplane seat landed just far enough away from the worst of it to grow up and live a life beyond the edge of the runway. Both engines lost power 32 seconds after takeoff. Only 1 person survived. On June 12, 2025, Air India Flight 171 pushed back from the gate in Ahmedabad for the 8-hour flight to London Gatwick. The aircraft was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner with 242 people on board. The 787 rolled down the runway for about 60 seconds, rotated at around 155 knots, and lifted off normally. For a few seconds, everything looked like any other departure. Then, just as the aircraft reached about 180 knots and climbed only a few hundred feet above the ground, something happened that almost never occurs outside a simulator. Both of the Dreamliner's fuel control switches, the guarded levers that control fuel flow to each engine, moved from run to cutoff, one after the other, about 1 second apart. With those 2 motions, both engines lost thrust. The world's latest generation long-haul jet became a 200-ton glider with almost no altitude and no time. An aviation enthusiast filming near the airport captured the jet passing low overhead, tail sagging, before it disappeared behind buildings and a fireball rose on the horizon. There was no mayday call, no drawn-out emergency. From liftoff to impact, only 32 seconds passed. The aircraft struck a tree, then the roof of a hostel block at a medical college, about 1.7 kilometers from the runway. The tail tore off. Sections of the fuselage punched through walls and floors. Parts of the cockpit came to rest hundreds of meters away. Fire spread almost immediately through the wreckage and the surrounding buildings. Inside the hostel, students were trapped amid debris, flames, and aviation fuel. In the middle of that chaos, in the forward cabin near an emergency exit, 1 man was still alive. Vishwashkumar Ramesh, a British citizen of Indian origin in his late 30s, had been seated in row 11, next to the left forward exit. In the crash sequence, the part of the fuselage containing his row broke away and came to rest near ground level in the hostel complex. The emergency door structure was torn open, leaving a gap to the outside. Stunned, injured, but conscious, he managed to climb out of the wreckage and onto the rubble. Phone cameras later captured him walking, dazed, before rescuers led him to an ambulance. He had burns on his hand, cuts to his face, and multiple minor injuries, but he was alive in a crash where nobody else on the aircraft would survive. Around him, the scene was catastrophic. The impact and fire killed 241 of the 242 people on board, including his own brother, and 19 people on the ground. It became the deadliest aviation accident in India in nearly 30 years, and the first fatal crash of a Boeing 787 anywhere in the world. Fire temperatures, estimated later at up to 1,500 degrees Celsius, were so intense that most victims had to be identified using DNA. In hospital, Ramesh tried to understand how he was still there when so many others were not. In interviews months later, he described constant flashbacks and almost no sleep. He called his survival a miracle, but said that when his brother died, "It took all my happiness." Physically, he recovered enough to walk and later be discharged. Mentally, he now lives with post-traumatic stress, replaying those seconds over and over again. For investigators, the questions focus on how a modern airliner could lose both engines at low altitude without any sign of external damage. The preliminary report confirmed the movement of the fuel control switches and ruled out obvious causes like bird strikes. It did not answer the most important question, why those switches moved. Some reports have suggested an intentional act. Indian investigators have called those claims speculative, stressing that no final conclusion has been reached. A later analysis found that this accident's survival rate, 1 person out of 242, or about 0.4%, is the lowest ever recorded for a scheduled commercial flight where anyone lived. In extreme crashes, survival often comes down to a combination of structure, fire, rescue, and timing that no passenger can fully predict or control. On a June afternoon over Ahmedabad, a state-of-the-art dreamliner lost the one thing an airliner cannot lose. And in the wreckage of a medical college hostel, one man stepped through a jagged doorway into a life that will never be the same. She was 12 years old and could barely swim. She survived the night alone in the Indian Ocean. Just after midnight on June 30th, 2009, Yemenia Flight 626 began its descent toward Moroni in the Comoros Islands. The Airbus A310 carried 153 people, most of them Comoran families who lived in France, making the long trip home via a connection through Yemen. Among them was 12-year-old Bahia Bakari from the Paris suburbs, traveling with her mother for a summer visit to relatives. This was the airline people used when they could not afford the bigger European carriers. Conditions were not simple. It was a dark, moonless night over the Indian Ocean, with gusty winds and patches of cloud around the islands. The airport did not have the kind of precision approach aids found at large hubs. The crew were setting up for a circling approach, flying toward one runway, then turning visually to line up with another. This kind of maneuver demands discipline, speed, altitude, and bank angle all have to stay under tight control. In the cockpit, that discipline frayed. The approach became unstable. Warnings began to sound, telling the crew the airplane was getting close to a stall. Instead of breaking off and going around, they pressed on. The A310 came in too fast, then too slow, wings rocking as the pilots tried to salvage the approach. Ground proximity alerts and pull-up warnings sounded more than once. The nose pitched up too far. The airspeed decayed. Less than 4 kilometers from the runway, still in the turn, the airplane stalled and dropped into the ocean. There was no mayday. Controllers on the ground simply watched the radar target disappear. Inside the cabin, there was no long warning. Passengers felt a strange change in the engine noise, a nose-up sensation, then a sudden drop and violent shaking. Bahia, seated next to her mother, later recalled a loud sound and everything going dark. When she became aware again, she was no longer in her seat, no longer in an airplane. She was in the ocean, at night, in rough water. Jet fuel burned her throat and lungs. Pieces of wreckage floated around her. She could hear screams somewhere in the darkness. Then one by one those voices faded until there was only the sound of the sea. Bahia could barely swim. She had no life vest. Instinct and luck brought her against a piece of fuselage large enough to cling to. She hauled herself partly onto it and held on. Waves washed over her. At times she slipped back into the water and had to fight her way up again. She had fractures in her pelvis and collarbone, cuts and bruises from the impact. She had spent her entire life in a city. Now she was alone on open water, in the dark, with nothing but metal debris under her hands, and the belief that her mother had somehow made it out and would scold her for not wearing a seatbelt. Hours passed. Sometime after dawn, local fishermen heading out from the coast spotted a shape moving in the swell among scattered wreckage and bodies. When they came closer, they realized it was a child clinging to a piece of the airplane. They hauled her aboard, gave her water, and brought her back to shore. For much of that first day, officials believed there were no survivors. Then the story shifted. A single passenger, a 12-year-old girl, had been found alive after spending the night in the Indian Ocean. Bahia was flown to Paris on a French government jet. She arrived with a fractured pelvis and collarbone, burns on her knees, and lungs damaged by fuel. She was released about 3 weeks later to continue recovery at home. Only then did she begin to fully understand that the airplane had crashed, that 152 other people had died, and that her mother was not coming back. The investigation concluded that Flight 626 had been lost because of inappropriate control inputs during an unstable approach, and because the crew did not respond properly to repeated stall warnings. Years later, a French court found the airline guilty of involuntary homicide. He was thrown from the wreckage because his seatbelt was not fastened. On March 6, 2003, Air Algérie Flight 6289 was preparing to depart from Tamanrasset, a city in the middle of the Sahara in southern Algeria. The Boeing 737 was heading north to Gardaia and then on to Algiers. It was already running about 3 hours late after mechanics changed a hydraulic pump earlier that day. By the time passengers finally boarded, the desert sun was high, the air was thin and hot, and everyone just wanted to get going. Among the 97 passengers was a 28-year-old Algerian soldier named Youcef Djillali, heading north like everyone else. He took a seat in the very last row. Up front, the cockpit was not as focused as it should have been. The first officer had done much of the preparation herself while waiting for the captain to arrive. When he finally came, he spent time chatting with the chief flight attendant instead of finishing the briefing. They set their takeoff speeds and taxied out to the runway. Conditions were good visually, but the airport's elevation and the heat meant the airplane was heavy and performance was near the limits. A safe departure would leave almost no room for mistakes. The takeoff roll looked normal. The engines spooled up, the 737 accelerated, and the captain called out the standard speeds. At rotation, the jet lifted off and began to climb, nose up, gear still down. Then, just seconds into the flight, a sharp bang shook the airplane. Inside the left engine, a fatigued turbine component had failed, shredding parts and robbing the engine of almost all usable thrust. The airplane suddenly had only one good engine. A 737 can fly safely on one engine if the crew reacts by the book. Keep the pitch under control, retract the landing gear, add power on the live engine and climb away at the right speed. Instead, the cockpit fell into confusion. The first officer, who was flying, cried out in surprise and asked what was happening. The captain immediately grabbed the controls and told her to let go, switching roles at the worst possible moment. She offered to retract the landing gear, but he never clearly answered. The crippled jet kept climbing with the gear hanging in the wind, eating away precious speed. No one called out the airspeed trend. No one said plainly, "left engine failure," and moved through the checklist. From the ground, witnesses watched the 737 climb only a few hundred feet, then start to lose speed. In the cockpit, the stick shaker rattled the control column, warning that the wings were about to stall. Instead of lowering the nose to regain speed, the captain held a high pitch, trying to keep the airplane away from the rocky terrain around the airport. The ground proximity system called out "don't sink" as the aircraft began to settle back toward the desert. There was no time for a second attempt. At about 400 feet above the ground, the jet quit flying altogether and dropped into a full stall. The tail and right side struck first in an open area just beyond the airport perimeter. The impact tore open the fuselage and ripped open the right wing, spilling fuel that ignited in a massive fireball. The wreckage slid across the sand, smashed through a perimeter fence, and finally came to rest in pieces near the highway. The cockpit crew died in the initial impact. Most of the passengers never had a chance to escape the flames. When firefighters arrived, they were met with a scene that looked unsurvivable. Only later, as rescuers spread out across the debris field, did they find something that did not match the rest of the scene. Lying in the sand, away from the largest pieces of wreckage, was a man in civilian clothes, badly injured but still breathing. It was Youcef Djillali, the soldier from the last row. At impact, he had been thrown clear of the disintegrating cabin, probably because his seatbelt was not fastened. That detail, which would normally be a safety violation, may have been the only reason he was not trapped in the burning wreckage. He was in a coma with multiple fractures, but doctors said his condition was serious rather than hopeless. Against every expectation, he was going to live. The investigation confirmed what the recorders suggested. The engine failure was serious, but contained. the airplane remained controllable. Simulations showed that with the correct actions, Flight 6289 could have climbed away on one engine and returned for an emergency landing. Instead, poor cockpit discipline, a rushed roll change, and the failure to retract the landing gear dragged the 737 back out of the sky. Of the 103 people on board, 102 died. A single soldier was found alive in the sand. His survival was not about luck alone. It sits on top of a long chain of human decisions that turned one contained engine failure into a tragedy in which one person walked away and everyone else did not. He was found in his seat, half a mile from the wreckage. On the morning of May 12, 2010, Afriqiyah Airways Flight 771 was on final approach to Tripoli after an overnight flight from Johannesburg. The Airbus A330 carried 104 people, many of them Dutch families returning home from safari holidays in South Africa. Among them was a 9-year-old boy from the Dutch city of Tilburg named Ruben van Assouw, traveling with his parents and 11-year-old brother. They had celebrated his parents' wedding anniversary on the trip. Now they were on the last leg home. Outside, the weather around Tripoli was murky. Visibility was reduced by haze and light fog hanging over the desert. The crew were flying a non-precision approach, using radio beacons rather than a full precision glide path. That type of approach leaves less margin for error, especially at the end of a long night when fatigue sets in. In the cockpit were 2 experienced pilots, but with relatively modest time on the A330. They briefed for the arrival, began the descent, and followed the procedure toward the runway. On paper, everything was set up for an ordinary landing. As the jet came down through 1,000 feet, the situation quietly began to slip. The crew did not acquire reliable visual contact with the runway. They should have broken off the approach and gone around. Instead, they let the airplane sink lower in marginal visibility. Terrain warnings started to sound, telling them they were too low. Only then did the captain call for a go-around. The autopilot was disconnected, thrust levers pushed forward, and the nose raised for a climb. For a few seconds, Flight 771 was on the correct escape path. What happened next is a textbook example of how the human body can mislead a pilot. As the engines surged and the airplane accelerated, the increasing push in their backs created a powerful somatographic illusion, making it feel as if the nose was pitching up too steeply, even when the instruments showed a modest climb. The first officer, flying the jet, responded to what his body told him rather than what his instruments showed. He pushed the controls forward, commanding nose down. Instead of correcting him, the captain added his own nose down input as well. On Airbus aircraft, the 2 side sticks do not move together. The system simply adds both inputs. The net result was a large, unrecognized push toward the ground. The jet, still at high power, was now diving. Ground proximity warnings shouted, "Pull up!" But in the confusion, the crew never established a clear picture of their flight path. Seconds later, Flight 771 slammed into sandy ground, about 1.2 kilometers short of the runway. The impact speed was over 260 knots. The A330 broke apart and scattered across a long strip of desert just outside the airport. A fire swept through much of the wreckage. For the rescue teams racing out from Tripoli, it looked like the kind of crash no one walks away from. Then they found something that did not fit the scene around it. A single airplane seat lying in the sand, some distance from the largest fragments. In it was a small boy, still strapped in, semi-conscious and bleeding from his legs, but breathing. He had been thrown clear when the cabin broke apart. Doctors found multiple fractures in both legs and significant blood loss, but no life-threatening head or internal injuries. He spent about 4 hours in surgery. When Dutch diplomats visited his bedside, he told them his name, that he was from Holland, and that his legs hurt. He did not know yet that there had been a crash, or that his parents and brother were gone. The investigation found no engine failure, no structural defect, no hidden system problem. The flight recorders revealed a crew who let an approach continue below minimums without visual contact, then mishandled the go-around so badly that a maneuver meant to save the airplane became the final link in the chain. Fatigue, confusion, and the somatographic illusion had driven the A330 into the ground. 3 days after the crash, a Libyan air ambulance flew Ruben back to the Netherlands. In Eindhoven, His extended family met him behind closed doors. They told him gently what no 9-year-old should have to hear, that he had been in a plane crash and that his parents and brother had not survived. In public statements, the family asked for privacy, saying they were dealing with two kinds of grief at once: the loss of loved ones and the burden placed on the one child who had come back. When you see these accidents written down, they all look the same at first. A line of numbers, a place, a date. 92 on board, 1 survivor. 28 on board, 1 survivor. 104, 1 survivor. The pattern repeats so often that it almost starts to feel abstract. Then you sit with the stories behind those numbers and the abstraction disappears very quickly. You stop seeing a statistic and start seeing a 17-year-old girl pulling maggots out of a wound in the rainforest. A flight attendant waking up in a hospital with her spine broken and no memory of the fall. A child on a Detroit freeway strapped into a seat that is no longer attached to an airplane. An 11-year-old in a Libyan hospital asking where his parents are, not knowing that every other family on his flight is already gone. What ties these flights together is not a magic trick, or a special seat, or a hidden rule that the survivors knew and everyone else missed. Julianne Kopska did not walk out of the Amazon because she picked the right row. She survived because trees and airflow slowed her fall just enough, because the part of the cabin she was in held together a little longer than the rest, and because once she hit the ground, she remembered what her parents had taught her about following water and not sitting still. Vesna Vulović did not set any record because she knew how to crash. A catering cart pinned her in a section of tail that happened to stay mostly intact, that happened to strike a wooded hillside instead of bare rock, that happened to come down where a medic from a nearby village could get to her in time. Cecelia and Ruben were lifted out of debris fields not because there's a safe place on an MD-82 or an A330 that guarantees survival, but because the exact way those cabins broke sent their seats out of the lethal zone by a matter of meters. Bahia did not spend the night in the Indian Ocean because she was a strong swimmer. She could barely swim at all. She lived because she ended up near a floating panel big enough to cling to, because the currents kept her close to the coast, and because a fisherman decided to head out in rough water at just the right hour after dawn. In the Sahara, Youcef was found in the sand, not because ignoring a seatbelt is secretly good advice, but because on that one day, in that one stall at low altitude, being thrown clear happened to put him beyond the worst of the fire. In Port Sudan, a 2-year-old boy landed near a tree instead of inside a burning cabin. In a wet rice field outside Phnom Penh, a baby ended up in the one pocket of wreckage that did not crush or burn. That is the uncomfortable balance at the heart of stories like these. On the one hand, they are so extreme that it is easy to file them under miracles and move on. On the other hand, the same investigation reports that record those 1 in a million survivals also lay out very clearly how human beings built the chains that led up to the crashes. They talk about unstable approaches left to continue, warning systems switched off or unheard, illusions that nobody in the cockpit challenged, pressure from late departures and holiday schedules, gaps in training, air traffic systems that were never fully rebuilt after wars, airlines flying older jets because newer ones were out of reach. None of that takes anything away from the courage it took to walk through 11 days of jungle, or face a lifetime of pain and survivor's guilt. It does remind us that these are not random bolts from a clear sky. They are rare, violent outcomes at the very edge of a system that is mostly safe, because people kept learning from everything that went wrong. If there is a lesson for the rest of us, it is probably smaller and more grounded than we might want. There is no way to pick a seat that guarantees anything. There is no gesture or superstition that can cancel out a long chain of engineering, regulation, training, and human decision-making. What you can trust is that commercial flying today is as safe as it has ever been. Partly because every one of these accidents forced regulators, airlines, and manufacturers to change something. Lavatory fires led to smoke detectors and new materials. Botched approaches led to stricter rules on stabilized landings. Single survivors in fields and rivers and city streets helped focus attention on cabin structures, seats, harnesses, and rescue response. Each life tells people in the system where the weak points really were. Most of us will never know what it feels like to sit in a broken airliner and realize you are the only one still breathing. When we fly, we will board, argue with a carry-on bag, watch a safety briefing, feel the push of takeoff and the bump of landing, and move on with our day. The people in this film did all of that once and then had their lives split cleanly into a before and an after. Behind the numbers, that is what these stories really are. Not just tales of survival in jungles and oceans and deserts, but quiet, ongoing lives built in the shadow of something almost no one else can understand. If you want to stay with us for more slow, detailed looks at what really happens in the air and on the ground, and at what changes because of it, you can subscribe and be here with us for the next flight.